if you have a reputable brand, which includes your mission, vision, and your values, you have the opportunity to receive 50% more qualified applicants.
Exude Human Capital Consulting hosts, hold on, let me close my door, bringing real stories from real professionals with real solutions to you. Join us as we navigate the ever-changing workplace with Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital, and our special guests. And welcome everyone to episode 6 of Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I can't believe that we're on episode 6, and I'm so thrilled today to have a very special guest, someone that I work with on a regular basis, and who's going to add some really important and interesting insights to today's conversation, which is about values or words on paper. I'm wondering how many of you out there have values, core values posted on your website that your company has worked really hard to hone in on those 3 or 5 or 6 or 7 words that represent what your organization is about. So today we're going to talk about what's the difference between having those words and really putting those words into practice. And to help me with this conversation today, I'm so pleased to introduce to you our special guest, a consultant with Exude, a facilitator extraordinaire, and a exceptional human capital consultant, Doug May. Welcome, Doug.
Well, thanks, Allison. It's great to be here today.
I was so excited when you agreed to be our guest to share your experience in working with organizations around values. And before we get started, I'm hoping that you can share a little bit about your background and your work in this space.
Sure. So so thanks, Allison. And that was a great introduction. So I'm going to have to live up to that now. So hopefully I will. And just to tell you a little bit about me, I've been in the HR, mostly the organizational development field for 30 plus years. So a big part of what I've done is the creation of culture. And so it's really looking at the culture of an organization and deciding what their mission, their vision is, and their values. And then how do you take those values off of the wall and turn them into behaviors and direction and procedures, and how do you use them to be the filter that you look at things through? I've worked with lots of different companies. I started out in the banking industry, which is where I began, but I was more on the technical side. And then I spent a long part of my career working at different companies in Las Vegas. So I worked with some gaming companies. One in particular was MGM Resorts. I worked with the Desert Inn. I worked with the Hard Rock Hotel. And then about 9 years ago, I started to do my own consulting, and I work with several different companies, including, so I've done culture stuff with gaming. I've done it with banking. I've done it in the cannabis industry. I've also looked at it with colleges and other educational institutions. So I have a lot of experience looking at core values, understanding core values, and then how do you take them off the wall and you make them real for not just your leadership, but for your team too? Because I think we want to make sure that everybody's making those decisions based on the values. So that's a little bit about me. I was a child prodigy. I usually have to tell that joke because I have to tell dad jokes. It's really a bad thing. So it's probably 37 years, I'm thinking, is when I started training. That's crazy. In the 80s, the crazy 80s. So.
Oh, the good 80s, the good old 80s, pretty and fun. So I'll date myself as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction. And I am excited to hear from you, given your background, your experience with this, what you've learned. But before we get into our conversation, I want to set a little context for our listeners. And this is really around how we're defining values, how we think about them. So we're going to define values as core or standards that guide the way you do business. Mm-hmm. We can think of them, fair to say, as the foundation of a culture,
right,
which then helps to guide decision making and actions of those within organizations.
Right.
And I think I heard you say it is, how do you bring them off the wall and align value to organizational culture, and using them to really differentiate an organization from a competitor. Something that will help you build trust with stakeholders, increase your brand recognition, and of course, attract and retain amazing talent. It's I did a little bit of research to help shape the context for this, and it's interesting. There was a study done just a couple of years ago. I want to say it was in 21 that ranked the most commonly cited values for companies. And Doug, this is going to be an on-the-spot test for you. Okay. What do you think the top 3 most cited values were?
Integrity.
Yes, number 1. Ding, ding, ding. 65% of respondents said that.
Pretty good. Excellence. No. Okay. Maybe diversity or DEIB, because that's been a new one. That's a lot. Gosh, now I'm really thinking. I'm failing. Service.
Not failing, but let me just say something. Service is number 3, and I'm giving you a little.
Okay, let me try to get the numbers. Let me try to get number 2.
Okay.
So I'm surprised it's not excellence, actually, because you see that everywhere. Relationships, maybe. Okay. I give.
Okay. All right. So number 1, integrity, 65%. Number 2, collaboration, 53%.
Oh, very nice.
Very nice. I was surprised. Not entirely surprised, but a little surprised. And then customer service or customer focus. So you said service. That's 48%.
Right.
The 4th one is respect at 35%. And it's interesting that you brought up diversity and equity, because those ranked rather low on this particular list.
Surprising.
It was a bit surprising. It was a bit surprising.
Right.
And I thought what was interesting is they the way this report ran, they also showed the correlation between how people reported the stated value against how employees experienced or reported that they experienced, and the stated value. And sadly, in diversity showed a negative. It was not well received or not showing up well in organizations. And by the way, this is a study that was done by MIT's Sloan School of Business. They looked at about 562 firms.
Wow.
And it was just kind of interesting. So as we think about our core values, Doug, tell us in your mind, what are our core values and what do they mean to an organization?
Well, it's interesting because you gave the definition and I wanted to add some things to that definition if I could. So I've always looked at core values, first of all, as filters. And when I say filters, it's when we're making a decision or we're talking about a policy or a procedure, we filter them through our values. And do they match our values? I also look at values in 2 other ways. This is what we're telling people we stand for. So if I am saying I stand for integrity, I had better act with integrity in everything that I do. The third is also not only what we stand for, but this is who we are. So we're an organization. So let's look at service, which was the third one that you talked about. So service is, if we're an organization that is a service provider, we want to make sure that we're providing the most excellent service. If that's one of our values, we really need to define what that means. And the last thing that I always talk to people about when it comes to values is that if it doesn't pass the values test, we don't do it. So if if someone is saying, for instance, I've worked with lots of different companies, and I've worked with lots of different companies in different levels of culture, where cultures has been one way, then it changes, or culture starts one way and it changes, sometimes for the better and sometimes not for the better, because it can really depend on who the leadership is. But when you're saying that you're about collaboration, or you're about taking risks, that's another one you'll see a lot, is taking risks. And if your company, if you take a risk and you fail and you're fired or reprimanded or whatever happens, then you're not a culture, you don't have a culture that takes risks. So that shouldn't be one of your core values. So that's a little, so I always look at it as filters. So, and who we are as a company.
I think that's a great way to think about it. And you bring up a really good point. If it's not, if it's just the words and the actions aren't in alignment, then it doesn't really mean anything. And I'm reminded of a large bank that in a few years ago received some unfavorable press and had some major challenges, of which they have corrected, I will say. But it's because one of their core values was integrity. And yet they had implemented incentive programs and policies around performance that encouraged behaviors that were really deceptive to the client, i.e. adding accounts that the clients never approved of. And leadership at that time, not today, leadership at that time looked the other way and didn't walk the talk.
Right.
So knowing that it's important, how can values be incorporated into a business in a meaningful way?
Well, I think everything with most things in a business, it starts with leadership. And it's about leadership being a part of, first of all, being part of developing the values. And the second piece is that they are demonstrating the values on a daily basis with everybody they come into contact with. So if you think about, because let me give you an example. So I can't tell you how many times early in my career, because as I got more into creating culture, we were able to kind of nip this in the bud. But I can't tell you how many classes that I've been in, like a customer service class or an onboarding class or something like that, where it's team members. And all of a sudden you're saying, well, these are the 5 things we want you to do with your customers. And they're typically based on the values, like greeting, how may I help you, and take care of their needs, those kind of things. And there's so many times that I've had team members say, my manager doesn't do that for me. So if you want to truly exemplify your values, you need to do it. You need to make sure it comes from the top down. Okay. How do you do that? So some of the ways you can do that is that you involve the leadership in creating your values. I've done exercises where we take a whole bunch of words, and you get leadership all together, and they circle all the words that are meaningful to them. So it could be things like excellence, integrity, equality, fun, generosity, those kind of things. And then you go through a process where each of the leadership come together in groups, and they start to hone those down. Like you say, well, I have honesty, but you have integrity. Aren't they really the same thing? So then you kind of whittle those down to where you get to your 4 or 5 core values. Then after that is then you talk about what are the leadership qualities that I need to demonstrate these core values. Now you're going to get a whole bunch of different levels of, how do I say this? Enthusiasm about adapting to the values or demonstrating the values. So you can get everywhere from, and I have like a scale. Do you want to hear my scale on leadership? So the first one is about getting permission. So I need to be told by my boss, the leader of the company, that I can do this. Okay, so why, you're a leader, step up. You don't need permission, just start to do it. The second one I call is lip service. And lip service is to say, well, so the leadership of the company talks about this all the time. So I'm just going to kind of yes them and make sure that they understand. The third level is passionate lip service, where I get really excited when I'm being your yes person. And then the next step is, then there's the last two are similar. One is leadership and one is active leadership. I prefer that leaders are active in what they do to promote the values. So that's the person that goes out, acts completely as a role model, jumps in with the team members to make sure that they have everything that they need to demonstrate those values and really lives them. Because what you'll find in culture change is that there's all levels of leadership and what they want to do. And the big thing about making that culture change is sometimes people need to not stay, we need to find the right people who will live those values. Does that make sense?
Oh, completely.
Okay.
And I'm in 100% agreement with you, is that it really starts with leadership in terms of living those core values. I want to dig a little bit deeper into how do we incorporate them into the employee experience. So if we think about recruitment and selection, at what point do you start taking these words? We've thrown out integrity, we've thrown out customer service, caring, whatever. How do you then pull them into your employee experience practices?
So this is how because typically in a lot of cases, values are focused on the external customer or client or guest. I always talk about with my leadership, in my leadership classes as well as in guest service classes, about the service profit chain. And how that works is that happy, engaged leadership create happy, engaged employees who create happy, engaged customers. Then that increases your bottom line. So we got to start there. So if we're expecting a certain level of service for our customers or clients, we need to provide that service and that experience for our team members or employees. So if I'm expected to, let me give you an example. So one of the things that I do a lot in the hospitality industry is that we have what's called the 10-5 rule. And the 10-5 rule is this. So if you're on the floor, like it could be in a hotel, in a store, it could be in a casino. When you're walking through and you come in contact with a guest, at 10 feet, you acknowledge them in some way. And at 5 feet, you greet, you say hello and greet and smile. And so you're going to acknowledge at 10, greet at 5. So one of the important things that we learned in one of the places that I worked is that a lot of our executives had this monstrous thing called a cell phone, and they would be walking through the casino. It was a casino that I worked at, and they'd be in their cell phone, and they wouldn't greet anybody, including their team members and customers and everybody, because they were taking care of something. So we had to literally tell our executives, you cannot have your cell phone out as you walk across the casino floor. And the whole purpose behind that is because we wanted to provide the same experience to our guests, to our employees, that we gave to our guests. So it starts there.
I think that's a great example. And I also think of things that I've seen throughout my career where you might have a core value of respect and you have someone coming in for an interview and you keep them waiting.
Right.
And so this is someone's very first experience with you. And yet, and it's one thing if you're keeping them waiting, but someone has come out to say, oh my goodness, we're so sorry. This is something, a meeting has run a little bit long, but I'm talking about just letting them sit there and not giving them any updates and not making them feel welcome. And I would also suggest that when we're using the value of respect, even when you're offboarding someone, regardless of the circumstances for which the person is leaving, that's a time where you can embed that value of respect to ensure that that person leaves with head held high and that you part in a respectful manner.
I want to even go further with that first thing that you talked about, and I'm just trying to find it on my computer because I just used this statistic, but I want to give you the correct statistic about the recruitment process. So I just did a speech where I talked about how to enhance, because as we know right now, the process of recruitment is very difficult. There's a lot of things that you really need to look at to make sure that you provide a great experience for them. So again, it goes back to talking about, so if you said that we're going to treat people with respect, we also need to look at that whole process and see if it's service oriented. So this is a statistic that I pulled from, and it's about 49% of respondents to a survey by PwC, which is a consulting firm, declined a job offer because of a poor recruitment experience. So if our core value is for respect and giving people positive service, and we're not doing that during the recruitment process, we could potentially lose those folks. Now, a couple other statistics that I want to talk about when I track. So your values are part of your brand. And so really what we need to look at now is, especially when it comes to the recruitment piece, is that we want to make sure that if we say that this is who we are as an organization, because people go out and they look at it, by the way, on your website. And then so you can, if you have a reputable brand, which includes your mission, vision, and your values, you have the opportunity to receive 50% more qualified applicants. And that's based on a study by Finances Online. And 89% of people who are thinking of applying with you look at your brand before they apply. So they're going to look at your values. They're going to look at your mission. They're going to look at your vision and say, is this a company I want to work for? So,
and I'll add to that, they're also going to look at the comments on Glassdoor, which are going to either support the values that you say you have or not support the values that you say you have. And that's becoming, particularly in the generations that are entering the workforce now, that's their go-to. That's how they determine whether or not this organization may be a fit.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So it's really about, if this is who we say we are, that's how we've got to act. That's who we've got to be. So it's really about that. And so if you think about it, if you think about a company, I'm sure you worked with or worked for companies that didn't match the values that they had on the wall, and everybody sees it. So it's unbelievable. And then so they don't do it either, right? So your team members are saying, well, if my boss isn't going to do it, I'm not going to do it either. So
right. Where have you seen values embedded and working really well?
Well, let me tell you a story. It was one of the projects I worked on, so I don't want to sound braggy, but I will. So when I worked for MGM Resorts, we had properties that were out on the Nevada, California state line. And this was about 20 years ago or so. So this was before they had opened up gaming and all of this, when they were just starting to open up gaming in California. And so what would happen is that when people would drive to Las Vegas from Southern California, their first opportunity to gamble would be when they hit Primm, is what is the name of the town. It was a small little, there was 3 casinos, 2 golf courses, the number 1 lottery store in North America because it's the busiest, because there's no lottery in Nevada, but all the Nevadans would drive down to California to get their tickets. And so they really didn't have to focus on service so much, because it was sort of like if you build it, they will come. So the people would stop, they'd gamble. It didn't matter what level of service they were getting. Then on their way home, when the traffic jam, it's sort of like the Jersey Shore traffic that we see out here on the East Coast. It's like that driving back on a Sunday during the day, back to California was a mess. So they would stop and they'd gamble. Well, then they started to open these casinos on tribal land in California. So it started to peel off some of those customers because I thought, well, you know what? I don't need to go there. I'll just stay here. And so people wouldn't stop at this place on the Nevada state line. So we went out there and we decided, okay, what are we going to do to help improve the service of this area and also make the employees feel good about the place they work? Because they'd watched their earnings go down and they were starting to think, oh my gosh, we're going to lose jobs and that kind of stuff. So we called it the hometown, and we called them the home team. And we had 4 core values, and those core values were excellence, integrity, teamwork, and fun. And the whole idea behind that was that we wanted to create an environment where the team members were happy to be there. And everything that we did, we ran through those core values. So the leadership was required to demonstrate them. We put that into the customer service training that we did. It went into policies and procedures. How do you create these core values? We used it in coaching. We used it in counseling. It was in performance appraisals, how they were rated. So how are you doing on excellence, or how are you doing on integrity? And we gave them all those tools to be successful. Now we were able to start to turn around the properties because we created an environment where everybody was all in, to use a Las Vegas term. And they were like, we are the home team. We demonstrate these core values. And that it was a very successful process. So what happened was the earnings started to go back up. They would never be to where they were prior just because the market had changed. But instead of going down, we stopped them from going down any further, and they started to go back up.
So it actually had a financial impact on this organization.
It did. And typically it does. Because if everybody's on the same page and they're all moving forward and we're demonstrating these values, then it has a great impact on the bottom line.
Yeah. And I think about where it hasn't worked so well.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any examples you want to share there. I think of one, I share the banking example, but I also think about Volkswagen had a bad run not too long ago, and ethics was one of their core values, and they prided themselves on promoting how environmentally safe their vehicles were.
Right.
And yet it came out that they had been able to what's the word? Game the system. Game the system. The game emissions testing system. Right. So and it was not something that was not unknown to senior leadership. So that's a big example. It certainly had a financial impact on that organization and onto the brand. But have you seen it in your experience with other organizations?
I have, and I don't want to name names, though, if that's okay. So,
of course not.
I have seen it in one in particular that I can think of is where it was a change in leadership, where the previous leader of the company was very much into the core values that had been established, and all of the programs and processes around that. How do we treat each other? How do we reach out? How do we work with the community, and all of those different areas? And the new person was more about, well, one of the things, lip service, I guess, passionate lip service that I talked about earlier, and really was just more about the bottom line. And instead of really looking at how embracing these values helps us increase the bottom line, it became more of a checkoff. And so they still made money, but it just the culture didn't seem the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people left, and it was just a whole switch. So,
and I think that's one of the impact you may see when values are not aligned with organizations. Disgruntled, unhappy leaders, team members,
right?
Poor communication.
Yes.
not meeting business goals in some cases, or low productivity or accountability, and turnover, quite frankly.
Right.
People don't want to be in that kind of an organization.
Right. And I mean, and just so you know, what happens typically if you're coming in and you're looking at a culture, and maybe you change the core values, or maybe you would do a new mission or vision, there are some people who just opt out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you get into the turnover, where so like, for instance, in some companies that I've worked with, there are leaders that say, you know what, this isn't for me, and they just go. And then sometimes you have to help people realize it's not for them as well on the other side. And so because you want the leadership that is going to be active and support the mission, vision, and values that you have.
So let's get into some tips that you could share.
Sure.
For our listeners who may want to refresh or perhaps create values for their companies. What are some things they should think about?
Well, this is how I look at it. So, like, how I've done it in the past is that you get your executives involved, and you have a strategic planning session where you look at what are we about? What are we about as a company? What is our mission and vision, and what values will support that? And you can go through different processes to do that. One of them, as I talked about earlier, was having all of the different potential values that you could have, and have people kind of vote on them, and then hone them down. Then you also want to talk to your team members to see if they resonate with your team members and also with your customers. So you want to put that information out there to see. So it's typically to look at, who are we as a company, and what do we stand for? And you're going to find that a lot of people like I said, are going to use integrity or collaboration and teamwork, as you talked about, and service. So it's really, that's the first step. Then once you've determined them, then they need to be in everything. Website, onboarding, any training that you do, policy, procedures, and as I talked about before. So the first step is to take people through a process and look at them and say, and if you have current core values, you probably want to say, is this really who we are still? Because, companies have changed a lot in the last 3 years. And so and really take a hard look at that. And there's processes you can do in a strategic planning, leadership type training where you really sit down and you have people think about, who are we as an organization?
Great. I would add a couple too that I've seen work quite well. And I think even about at Exude, our core values at Exude, making them actionable. Speaking of them, I mean, we've talked about examples of single words, but how do you really make them actionable and linked to results? So I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of ours. We have one that's called Welcome Disruption. And that's, to help think about, we welcome change. We know that it is the one constant that we're always dealing with, and how we think about it, how we respond to it is a demonstration of our values. Another one is be kind, be true. So regardless of any interactions you have with individuals, those that you agree with, those you don't agree with, always lead yourself by being kind, being true. And it guides your decision making as well. So I think that it's important to really think about how people can take action on those values, and building that into your core values. And then we had a conversation earlier today about core values. And in your mind, what's the optimal number of core values that an organization should have?
Well, I think 4 or 5 is where I come in on it. I mean, and if you do 3, that's fine too. My whole thing is that they need to be easy to remember. And sometimes it's a one word and then you have a definition, but I also like the exudes as well, where it's an action. So in most cases, what we've done with values is you'll define each one of them for the folks, because you want to make sure that people get it. And that and that they understand what it really means. So yeah, I think 4 or 5 is is optimal.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with you. At somewhere between 3 and 5. I have seen organizations come up with 8 to 10, and it's really challenging for people to absorb that and make meaningful decisions around that. I think if you tighten it, and I heard you say earlier, which I think is a really good point, when you're building these, really have that session where you say, could these be combined? Are these saying the same thing, so that you're not just creating a value for the sake of having another word on a piece of paper?
Well, and I can tell you an interesting thing is when I develop training based on values, is I often find it when I'm doing that. Because typically when you do some training around values and you're tying it into service or you're tying it into something else, you go, okay, this is what excellence means. And then you go through each one and you have an activity. And then all of a sudden you're like, I can't figure out how to distinguish this one from the other one. so, and because, one typical is integrity and honesty, or maybe teamwork and collaboration. They're really the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And teamwork is probably just a subset of collaboration, and honesty is a subset of integrity. So if you're having trouble like coming up with different examples, an example that's different from the other value, then you probably need to figure out where you can put that value. So
great. Well, this has been such an interesting conversation to me, Doug, and I so appreciate you taking the time. I want to share with our listeners, and I don't know if you've ever tried this, but for all of you listening to this podcast, if you want to get a sense of how well your values are incorporated throughout your organization, take a walk around. And I know for some of you that may be a virtual walk around, but the next time you're on a call, Zoom call, Teams call, or you're physically in your office, ask a random number of people to share the first 3 words that come to mind when they describe what it feels like to work at your company. And write those words down and see how well they align to the values that your organization has. It's one of those simple, easy to do ways to calibrate if what your culture says it stands for and does is actually felt by the people in the organization. Have you ever tried that, Doug?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm all about, we used to go out, like when we were really doing the work, we would go out and we kind of quiz people on them, and see if it worked and see if they're doing it and see if it's meaningful to them. But I like the idea of not prompting them. I like that a lot, to see what they come up with. We would go out. Go ahead.
Even if they don't use the exact words that you have for your values, the essence of those words should show up. If it's being fully integrated into the employee experience. So that said, I want to thank you so much, Doug, for being our guest today and for sharing your insights. And to all our listeners out there for taking time to tune in to another episode of Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I want to leave you with a quote to help you think about the importance of values to an organization. And it says, it's not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are. And that is from Roy Disney. So thank you for joining Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. Until next time.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.